When you have a team and yet decisions still escalate to you, problems still land at your desk, it is highly frustrating. You can't help but feel like, what am I spending all this money on payroll for if I'm still having to do all the work myself? You've built the structure, you have the organizational chart, you've defined the roles, you've decided who's responsible for what, but yet somehow your team keeps on coming back to you. If that sounds like your business, this is the video for you. This is one of the most frustrating stages that a business owner can find themselves in. You've done everything that you thought you were supposed to do. You've hired, you've invested, you've created roles, created documentation, you're delegating, and yet you're still the person holding everything together. The reason for that is simple. Structure alone does not produce accountability. It doesn't tell people how to operate. It doesn't tell them what decisions to make. It doesn't tell them what good performance looks like. And it certainly doesn't teach them when to solve a problem themselves and when they should bring it to you. So in this video, I want to show you what needs to sit underneath your organizational structure so that your business can start to operate without you being in the center of everything. We're going to be looking at 4 things. Why the organizational structure that you have at the moment is not enough. Secondly, we're going to look at the management rhythms that keep your organization moving without your constant intervention. And finally, we're going to determine whether you actually have the right people in the right seats. This video is the 3rd installment in the 4-part Founder Freedom Architecture series that I developed. And by the end of this video, you should be able to look at your organization and identify exactly where the dependency is coming from. Because in my experience as a business owner for over 17 years and owning a licensed, regulated, highly operational service business, I understand all too well how important it is to build an organization that functions without you. When you as a founder are central to everything, there is nothing more draining. That experience changed the way I think about business. And in particular, it changed the way I look at accountability, because that's not something that you can create by telling people you need to take more ownership. Accountability is something that you build into the architecture of an organization. And when the architecture and structure is right, accountability becomes a lot easier to manage. In working with many 6- and 7-figure business owners who are exactly in your position, I've seen the frustration that comes about when you feel like you've invested in people, you're paying salaries, you're training them, you're giving people opportunities, you genuinely want to see them succeed in their roles. And yet you're having to step in at every step of the way. You're having to remind people, you're having to keep check of people, constantly approve things, and eventually you can't help but to ask yourself, where have I gone wrong? Have I hired the wrong people? Maybe. But before you decide that, I want to ask you a different question. Have you built an environment in which good people can be accountable? Because a person cannot be accountable for something that hasn't been clearly defined. They cannot make good decisions if they don't know which decisions they have authority to make. They cannot improve if they don't receive meaningful feedback. And they cannot operate independently if all of the knowledge required to make a decision lives in the founder's head. So sometimes what might look like a people problem is in fact a management infrastructure problem. And that distinction matters a lot more than a lot of people think. Because if you have a structural problem and you keep on hiring, thinking that will solve it, it won't. You simply create more people for you to have to manage. When you build a functioning management and accountability structure within your business, several things begin to change. Your team stops coming to you for answers because the answers exist within the system rather than exclusively in your head. Your best people become more capable because they have genuine ownership rather than constantly waiting for permission. You stop being the quality control department because standards are established, measured, and managed within the organization. And perhaps more importantly, you begin to experience the difference between being a leader and being an operator. Many business owners think that they are leading when in reality, they're supervising. They're answering questions, they're checking work, solving problems, chasing people, approving decisions. That is simply operational survival. Leadership, on the other hand, is different. Leadership is about strategy, setting direction, building capability, making the decisions that only you can make, creating an organization that is capable of operating without you. And your management structure is what allows you to accomplish all of that. Let me give you an example. If you haven't watched the second part of this series, it will be really great for you to watch that, because that will help to inform your understanding of this example and this part of the series. So in the previous video, we built up Maya's organizational structure. We defined the various functions within her business. We created the position contracts for the various roles in her company. She knew who was responsible for operations, clients' accounts, creatives, finance. And for the first few weeks, that all worked well. She was relieved. Finally, everyone knew what they were supposed to be doing. But it wasn't long before old behaviors started to creep in. Liz, who was now the account manager, was still coming back to her to respond to difficult client emails. Daniel, who had creative responsibility, was still going back to Maya for approvals before sending out work to client. And whenever a deadline was under pressure, Maya was still at the head of everything. And this happens because when you build out your organizational structure, although it tells you who is sitting in what seat, your positions contract tells individuals what part of their roles that they own. It doesn't necessarily tell them how to operate independently. And that is the gap. And that gap is filled by three things: management rhythms, feedback loops, and decision-making frameworks. A management rhythm is simply a regular, structured cadence through which an organization communicates, reviews performance, and resolves issues. It's not about having endless meetings. In fact, it should produce the opposite. A good management rhythm should reduce unnecessary communication because people know when and where things will be dealt with. In Maya's organization, when we developed this, it was a weekly team meeting of 45 minutes in which the account director chaired that meeting. It has a fixed agenda. People know who owns what issue, what decisions need to be made, what risks need to be managed. Each person reports on their functional area. Problems are surfaced, owners are identified, actions are agreed. Maya may attend, but strictly for strategic oversight, not as the person solving every problem. Then monthly one-to-ones were introduced. These were individual performance development conversations with their direct reports. These meetings are not task check-ins, they belong in a weekly rhythm. These conversations are about how an individual is meeting the standards of their position, where they are developing, what support they need, what isn't working, what needs to change. Again, Maya doesn't need to be part of these meetings. It's for the account director or CEO to head these meetings. She just simply receives the information that she needs to lead the business. Then we had the monthly leadership review, and this is simply Maya and her COO to go over financial performance, progress against their strategic objective, team capacity, risks, problems, structural or people decisions that genuinely require Maya's intervention. And then finally, quarterly business reviews. This is the meeting where Maya fully steps into her leadership role. She's looking at where the company is in relation to the goals that were set previously. What has worked? What didn't? What are they changing? What are the plans for the next quarter? This is where vision and strategy are discussed, and that is Maya's job as the business owner, because the business owner should not be the person managing every single layer of the business. You should be managing the business at only the layer that you should or that you can manage it at. Now we come to one of the biggest causes of founder dependency, and that is decision making. Because your team can have responsibilities, they can have a job description, you can have an organizational chart. But if nobody knows what they're actually allowed to decide, then you naturally remain the escalation point. And this is why every business needs a decision framework. People need to know, what can I decide for myself? What requires my manager? And what genuinely requires the founder? I usually see this for most businesses as a 3-level framework. So at the first level, you would have the decisions that team members can make independently. This might look like routine client communication. It might look like internal deadlines, creative decisions, day-to-day operational issues, that sort of thing. Then you have level 2. This is where you require management approval. This might look like changes to deadlines, changes to briefs, addressing significant complaints, unplanned expenditure below a certain threshold or above a certain threshold, or anything that affects another functional area. And at level 3, this is where we have decisions that are requiring you as the business owner. So this might look like accepting or declining a major client, significant unplanned expenditures, major changes to strategy. Basically, decisions that materially or fundamentally affect the direction of the business. These belong to you. I want you to notice what I'm doing here. This is not about making you redundant. This is not about making you unavailable. It's about making you available for decisions that require you working on your business rather than working in the business. And that fundamentally is the difference between an operator and an owner. Because the goal isn't about making sure nobody comes to you for solutions or asks you questions. The goal is to make sure that you're only being asked about things that genuinely require your level of authority. There's a very simple principle that I want you to remember, and that is responsibility without authority creates frustration. Authority without accountability creates chaos. In order for you to build a self-reliant organization, you're going to need those 3 things. Responsibility. This is about what people own. Authority is about what decisions they're allowed to make. And accountability is about what results they're ultimately responsible for producing. Let me give you an example. If somebody is responsible for customer satisfaction, but they cannot make reasonable decisions to resolve customers' problems, then you haven't given them ownership. If someone has the authority to spend money, but isn't accountable for the result, then you create risk. Responsibility, authority, and accountability have to move together because that is what creates genuine ownership. Now, the final part of this management infrastructure is feedback. Because accountability without feedback is simply expectation without information. Your people need to know what is working, what isn't, where they're meeting the standard, where they're falling below it. They need to know what needs to change. I like to think about this at 3 levels. Number 1 is real-time feedback. If someone handles something exceptionally well, tell them. If something is wrong, address it while it is still relevant. And be specific. Don't say, you need to communicate better. Instead, say, the client wasn't updated for 5 days after the issue was identified. Our standard is that clients are updated within 24 hours. What happened? That is actionable feedback. Simply saying your communication was poor could mean a manner of things. Was it the tone? Was it the actual content of the communication? Was it the way they said it? But in telling them that the issue with their communication was in the timing of it, you're also communicating the standard that is expected of them, which is that they respond within 24 hours. That allows that individual to have a clear understanding of what they got wrong, what is the expectation, and how to not repeat it again. The second is monthly performance feedback. And with this type of feedback, what we're looking at is measurable standards that are attached to their position. So we're not talking about, how do you think things are going? This is a common one that people do in performance reviews. It's important that you remove personality from business. In the last video, I talked about not hiring, not operating your business based on personality, but rather function, because you want to keep it objective. You want there to be measurable outcomes. So rather than how are things going, it's about here is the standard, here is the actual result, here is the gap. This is not personality driven. It's not about feelings. It's about facts. It's about metrics. It's about data. That creates for a more objective conversation. And finally, annual reviews. This is where you get to zoom out. You're looking at how the person has performed overall. Has their role evolved? Has the business changed? Does the person's role still make sense? Is the person still fit for that role? And this is the management strategy that connects back to your people strategy. So let's return back to the question I asked much earlier, which was, do you have the right people? Maybe. But I want you to use this sequence. First, check the seat, and then assess the person. Before you conclude that somebody isn't performing, ask, did I clearly define their function? Did I define what good performance looks like? Did I give them the authority required to perform the function? Do they have access to the information they need? Do they have a decision framework? Do they receive regular feedback? If the answer to any of those questions is no, then you haven't properly tested the person. You've simply tested the absence of structure. But once the structure is there and someone is still not performing, you can then have a much more honest conversation about, is this a skill gap? Is it a will gap? Or is it a fit gap? If it's a skills gap, then they simply just do not have the capability. This can be remedied with training, mentorship, coaching. If they have a will gap, this is a much bigger issue because essentially they have the capability, but they are unwilling to operate at the required standard. That is a much more serious problem because you cannot train someone into wanting to take accountability. With a fit gap, they may be talented, they may be hardworking, they may be a great employee, but they're simply not the right person for that particular function. And this could be because the business has evolved, but that doesn't necessarily make them a bad employee. And a good organizational design requires you to be honest about that. This is what I mean when I talk about having the right people in the right seats. Every function in your organizational structure should have someone who has the capability to perform it, the willingness to own it, and the capacity to perform it at the standard at which your organization requires. When those things come together, something changes. You don't have to chase people. You don't have to constantly remind them. You don't have to be the person holding every part of the business together. The structure tells them where to sit. The positions contract tells them what they own. The management rhythm tells them how the organization operates. The decision framework tells them what they can decide. The feedback loop tells them how they are performing. And suddenly, you have something that resembles an actual organization. I want you to do something after watching this video. I want you to look back at the past 7 days and write down 5 decisions that you made that you genuinely believe somebody else should have made. Then ask yourself, who should have made those decisions? Then, why did it reach me? Was it because they didn't have the authority? Was it because they didn't have the information? Was it because they didn't know what the standard was? Was it because there was no manager? Was it because you genuinely are the only person who could have made that decision? Or was it because you have trained them to come to you? When I'm working with business owners, helping them to develop their team structure, one of the things that I always tell them is to stop being so helpful. And I know that as high performers, this sounds counterintuitive because a lot of people think to themselves that they are managing the quality of the business, of the service, of the products, whatever the case may be. What a lot of business owners don't realize is that when you jump in to solve problems, you are building a system of dependency. You're building a system whereby you are teaching your team to come to you for answers. When we're talking about systems, a lot of people think systems is purely about SOPs and tech and all that sort of thing. A system is simply a way of doing something consistently that produces a result. And one of the ways that you can get around this is by simply stopping it. When somebody comes to ask you a question, I'm not saying to shun them away and not help them. No, I want you to ask them for their thoughts, probe their understanding, probe their thinking process, and encourage them to come up with the solution themselves. When you do this, you empower them by showing them that they are capable of coming up with the answers for themselves. Now, if they genuinely do not have the answers, then rather than just giving it to them, coach them through it. Coach them through your decision-making framework. How are you arriving at the answer? This is how you start to develop a self-managing team. This is how you empower your team to take ownership over their functions, over their roles, over their decisions. And this is particularly important for the smaller businesses that might not have secondary management in place. So if it's just you and your team, this is a very important framework to develop in order to remove that founder dependency. By the time that team member comes to you 2, 3, 4 times and they actually come up with the solution themselves, they then become empowered to take ownership over their decisions. So before I went off on a tangent, that exercise tells you about the maturity of your management structure. Because as I said earlier, the goal is not about zero founder involvement. It's about intentional founder involvement. And that is ultimately what the Freedom Architecture Framework is about. You're not trying to build a business where you disappear and nobody knows you. Absolutely not. You're trying to build a business where your presence is strategic rather than operational, where your team can make decisions, where your managers can manage, where people understand what they own, where performance is visible, where problems are dealt with at the right and appropriate level, and where you can finally spend your time doing the things that only you can and are supposed to do. Because there's a huge difference between being the owner of a business and being the person who's responsible for keeping everything within the business moving. One gives you leverage, the other gives you a very tiring and expensive job. But there is one final problem that we need to address. You have the organizational structure, you have the right people, they understand their responsibilities, they have authority, they know how decisions are made, you have the management rhythms, the feedback loops, and yet the business still depends on certain people knowing exactly how things work. So what happens when your best employee leaves? What happens when somebody is sick? What happens when you want to scale? What happens if you decide to open another location? What happens if you want to sell your business? Because if the knowledge required to operate the business lives in people's heads, you still have a dependency problem. And this is where we go to next in the final part of the Freedom Architecture Framework series, where we will be talking about your systems strategy. How do you take the knowledge, processes, and ways of working inside your business and turn them into an organizational asset? How do you create systems that produce consistent outcomes without relying on individual geniuses? And ultimately, how do you build a business that continues to perform consistently when the people inside the business change? That is the final step. Structure tells you where the work belongs. Management tells you who owns the outcomes. Systems tell you how those outcomes get produced consistently. And when all those three things work together, you finally have the foundation of a business that does not require you to be at the center of everything. This is what operational freedom actually looks like. So I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.